You've probably believed that the avoidant person in your life doesn't need you, right? They pull away when you get close. They go silent when you open up. They make you feel like you're too emotional, too much, and eventually, you start to believe they're better off without you. But today, I'm here to flip that narrative. My name is Jim Rohn, and in this video, I'm going to share a truth that might just blow your mind. The avoidant needs you more than you need them, not out of dependency, not out of weakness, but on the deepest level where their nervous system and psyche depend on something only you were able to give them: unconditional love. You weren't just someone they cared for. You were the space where they were finally allowed to be human. You were the one place where they didn't have to perform strength they didn't feel. And here's the painful irony. That love terrified them. They pushed you away not because you weren't enough, but because you were everything they'd never believed was possible. If you've been hurt by that, this video is for you. Not just to help you understand them, but to wake you up, so you don't abandon yourself trying to love someone who's still running from their own heart. Stay with me till the end, because I promise what I'm about to share won't just give you clarity, it will give you peace. And don't forget to hit subscribe if you want more content that helps you grow, heal, and love smarter. Here's the truth no one tells you. Someone with avoidant attachment, no matter how distant, indifferent, or emotionally unavailable, they may appear needs you more deeply than they can ever admit. But they don't need you in the way you might think. Not to fill their loneliness, not to depend on you, and certainly not to have another person who loves them unconditionally. They need you because, in your presence, their nervous system can finally rest. You're not just a person to them, you're space, breath, and emotional refuge from the lifelong performance of strength. You quietly become part of their emotional ecosystem in a way they can't even control. These are people who've spent their lives self-regulating, hiding pain, compartmentalizing emotion, and surviving in isolation. Then suddenly you who sees past the facade, you who doesn't flinch when their messy parts show up, you who stays grounded when they spiral, you who offer presence instead of pressure, empathy instead of demand. You don't rush their healing, you simply stand there, restable, kind, real. And that's where something incredible begins. While you're not trying to fix them, you unknowingly become the most powerful emotional catalyst they've ever encountered. Why? Because with you, they glimpse a version of themselves they've never met, the version that doesn't have to perform strength, suppress feelings, or control everything to avoid being hurt. You become their external emotional regulator, not because you force your way in, but because your calm, your attunement, your consistency whispers to their nervous system, it's safe now. But here's where your own boundaries must speak. You are not responsible for carrying their emotional evolution. Healing doesn't happen because you love them enough. Healing begins when they decide to stop running from themselves. You may be the mirror, the spark, the proof that love exists, but you are not their therapist. You are not their emotional container. You are not their coping mechanism. This is where self-respect becomes sacred. You get to say, the love I offer is rare but not free of emotional responsibility. If someone is lucky enough to be loved by you, they need to handle your heart with care. If they walk away, it's not because you weren't enough, it's because your enoughness demanded growth they weren't ready to face. And if they aren't willing to turn inward, to meet themselves with honesty, then you don't have to stay and pay the price for their avoidance. You don't have to shrink so they feel less overwhelmed. You don't have to dim your light just to be palatable, because you deserve a love that doesn't ask you to be less to feel more safe. And from the moment you became their emotional anchor, a process they had long resisted healing begins to quietly take root, not through dramatic gestures or declarations, but through your steady, honest, unconditional presence. Your being there without demands, without judgment, becomes something profoundly unfamiliar to them. You don't require them to earn love. You don't need them to be fully self-aware before being accepted. You simply need them to be real, even if that real is messy, confused, or imperfect. For the avoidant, this quietly overturns a foundational belief that love is transactional, that affection is conditional, that being loved requires being impressive. They were raised to believe that only when they're strong enough, need little enough, and take up the least space will someone stay. But you came along and didn't play by those rules. You didn't need them to behave. You didn't need them to smile when they were exhausted. You only needed their presence as they are. And with every moment you chose to stay, even when they were distant or cold, something inside them began to crack open. Maybe I don't have to be someone else to be loved. Through your quiet consistency, you began gently pulling them away from the emotional wastelands of their childhood, where feelings were dismissed, where needing someone equaled weakness, and where mistakes were punished with emotional withdrawal. Your love became a quiet revolution. You didn't tear down their defenses, you just sat there, steady and unwavering, until those walls no longer made sense. But it's also for that very reason that you became their biggest fear. Because if your love is real, it forces them to confront something even scarier, that what they've believed all this time to protect themselves might have been wrong. And that's terrifying. They've built their survival on control, and now you show up as living proof that safety doesn't require control. They've believed that needing someone makes you weak, but you quietly showed them that needing is part of being human, not something shameful. And this is where your clarity must be strongest. Do not let the healing you bring become the reason you accept harm. You are not responsible for absorbing the fallout of their avoidance. You're not a substitute parent. You're not a permanent emotional sanctuary for someone unwilling to face themselves. You are a partner, not a rehab facility for wounded souls unwilling to take responsibility. Self-respect means knowing that while your love can heal, it only works if the other person is also willing to heal themselves. If not, you become a soothing balm for a fear they never intend to confront. And while they may feel better with you around, you slowly, quietly begin losing yourself in the process. And perhaps the thing that unsettles them most, what even terrifies them, is not your absence, but the undeniable truth that you are living proof unconditional love exists. While they grew up learning they had to earn affection by performing, by succeeding, by being independent, low maintenance, and non-disruptive, you came along and shattered that equation. You didn't ask them to impress you. You didn't demand emotional neatness. You didn't require perfect timing or polished responses. You simply wanted them to be real. For the first time, they weren't measured by how quickly they could regulate their feelings, but seen for why they shut down in the first place. For the first time, they could sit in silence, unready, unsure, emotionally unrefined, and still not be abandoned. With you, they didn't have to fix it before they were allowed to stay close. And that, though they may never say it, shook the foundation of everything they believed about love and safety. So when you left, whether because of the hurt, the exhaustion, or because your presence was no longer welcomed, they didn't just lose a partner. They lost the one and only person who had ever given them permission to live. Not just survive through control and logic, but to actually live as themselves. Before you, they existed through performance. With you, they glimpsed the possibility of being raw and still being enough. You didn't just show them that love was real. You showed them they, too, were capable of connection, of vulnerability, of becoming someone different. You awakened a part of them they had long buried beneath their defenses. When you were patient, they began to listen. When you stood still with dignity, they began to respect space. When you didn't chase, they began to understand. Love is not something you grip tightly out of fear, but something you stay near because it feels safe to return. And this is the moment where your own self-respect becomes critical. You may be the spark that ignites change, but you are not the one responsible for carrying them through it. They have to face themselves. They have to choose to dismantle the very defenses that keep rejecting what they crave most. You are not their long-term therapy. You are not a temporary home for someone unwilling to do the inner work. Real love isn't just about how deeply you can care for someone, it's also about knowing when to step away so they can learn how to care for themselves. You didn't abandon them. You simply stopped abandoning yourself to keep love alive. And that's what makes you strong. Not because you've never felt pain, but because you've learned not to stay in relationships that require you to betray yourself to hold on to someone else. And then, ironically and painfully, the truth becomes clear. The very unconditional love you gave them is what scares them the most. Not because you did anything wrong. Not because you loved in the wrong way, but because accepting that love means confronting a bitter truth that the defenses they've spent their whole life building may have never actually kept them safe. That emotional suppression, avoidance, and control didn't protect them. They simply kept them distant from the very connection they've always craved. Your love leaves no room for the old narratives. Everyone leaves. If they knew the real me, they'd walk away. Needing someone is dangerous because you were there. You did see the parts they hide, and you didn't leave. The love you gave shattered the mental structure they used to justify their emotional isolation. And for someone with an avoidant attachment style, that feels like an internal earthquake. You didn't just bring them affection, you became a mirror. When you gave trust, patience, and empathy, they didn't just receive it. They were forced to see themselves fully, honestly, and that reflection isn't always easy, because it brings up old shame, forgotten wounds, and buried fears of being left, of never being enough, of reaching for love and being punished for it. Now, with you offering love without conditions, they can no longer blame the world. They can no longer say, "It's always like this." They're left with only one truth. They are pushing away the very thing they claim they never got. And right here is where many avoidants choose to run. Not because you weren't enough, but because you were too real, too clear, too close to the truth they don't want to face. That they are lovable, yes, but in order to truly receive love, they'd have to let go of the identity that once kept them safe. They'd have to admit that strength doesn't mean never needing anyone. That independence isn't the same as emotional isolation, and that kind of shift, it's not easy. This is also where you must remember your deepest truth. You are not wrong to love deeply, but you will hurt yourself if you stay just to prove your love was enough. You've already done what few ever could. You showed them there is another way. But walking that path is their choice, not your responsibility. They might not say it. They might leave as if you meant nothing. But somewhere deep down, they know. You were the first to truly see them, to touch their soul, to love them not for their performance, but for their presence. And whether or not they admit it, that changed them permanently. And you, the one who loved with everything in you, hold this truth like a badge of dignity. Real love does not fear being seen. Anyone who runs from it isn't rejecting you, they're avoiding themselves. Because to accept the kind of love you gave means to finally believe, I am worthy, I am loved, I can let someone in. And then, at some point, they will push you away. Not because you don't matter, not because you did something wrong, but because your presence has become too real, too accurate, too close to something they're not yet ready to face. Trust. Trust in safety. Trust in connection. Trust in love that doesn't demand performance. And because you've come to represent all those things, shielding, kindness, consistency, they have to push you away to preserve the very system that's helped them survive, their defenses. Don't mistake this for indifference. Their withdrawal, their coldness, their silence isn't saying, I don't care. It's whispering, I don't know how to hold this without losing myself. They fear that if they let you all the way and into the parts of their emotional world they've never let anyone see, the armor they've built so carefully will collapse. And to them, losing that armor means losing control, losing agency, losing their sense of identity. That's why they do what breaks their own heart. They leave before you can. They dismiss the emotions you share. They delay responding to your texts. They downplay everything that matters. They choose logic over connection, distance over closeness. I'm fine over anything real. And you, the one who once felt like home, suddenly feel like a threat to their fragile inner order. And you'll feel it. You'll notice their eyes begin to drift when you get too sincere. You'll sense the tension when you speak your truth. You'll see them become busy, less engaged, and you'll start wondering, did I do something wrong? But please, don't erase yourself from the equation. You didn't do anything wrong. You're simply standing in front of someone who doesn't yet know how to hold what they've never believed was real. And this is the moment you must decide. Will you keep trying to prove that your love is strong enough to withstand their unconscious retreating? Or will you choose to step back and protect your own dignity, to remind yourself that you don't have to beg to stay in a space where your love makes someone uncomfortable? Love, when it's healthy, doesn't ask you to shrink. It doesn't make you feel guilty for having feelings. It doesn't require you to constantly self-adjust, just so the other person doesn't feel afraid. If they can't yet recognize the value you bring, that doesn't mean you're lacking. It simply means they still prioritize the illusion of safety over the reality of connection. You cannot tear down defenses that someone is still clinging to. You can only stand firm in your own heart and say, I came with real love. I don't need to twist myself to be chosen. Because true love, the kind you gave, is never a burden. It is an invitation. But not everyone is ready to walk through that door. Whether you leave or stay, one truth remains. They still need you. Not in a way they'll ever admit, not through words but in the silent void your absence creates. Because you weren't just a partner, you were the first living proof that real connection doesn't require self-betrayal. And once they've tasted that, it can't be unseen. They can keep moving, go on with work, date other people, laugh like nothing ever happened. But something in them has changed forever, and that part will always belong to you. That longing doesn't disappear. It just gets buried beneath new projects, packed schedules, intellectual rationalizations, and stoic words. But don't let the surface calm fool you. No one can replace a presence that made them feel safe to breathe. No one can overwrite what it felt like to be loved without having to perform. You weren't just comfort, you were the space where they could finally exhale without tension. And that is not something easily replaced. Because what you offered wasn't fleeting charm, it was the depth of connection you built through consistency, kindness, and emotional bravery. So they might pretend they're fine, they may never call again, but there will be moments in the silence, in a dream, in the glance of a stranger that resembles youth memory resurfaces like instinct, not because you were perfect, but because with you, they felt like they didn't have to be perfect to be loved. And you, even though you were pushed away, even though you were deeply hurt, must hold one truth close. Your presence did what they never believed was possible. It made a heart they thought was frozen beat again. Whether they ever come back or not, whether they move on or not, you are a milestone in their emotional evolution. You planted a seed. And sometimes, the beginning of someone's healing starts with that seed of love that didn't force, didn't demand, and didn't need to be rewarded. Remember this, you weren't their ending, you were their awakening. You are something they can't find in anyone else, not because you're better, but because you were brave enough to love someone who hadn't yet learned how to love themselves. And whether they admit it or not, whether they choose someone else or not, the truth still quietly remains. They still need you, but not in a way they know how to receive. And if you've ever loved an avoidant, if you stayed through the silence, if you opened your heart only to be met with walls, if you reached out while being pushed away, then hear this. You did not fail. You are not lacking because your love wasn't received. You're not too sensitive, too needy, or too much. On the contrary, you were the living proof of what they didn't yet believe in, that love can be kind, steady, and unconditional. You did what many never have the courage to do. You loved without losing yourself. And then, when you saw that your love wasn't being honored, you chose to walk away, not because you stopped caring, but because you finally cared enough for yourself. That's not giving up. That's growth. It may take them years to realize what you gave. They may never admit it to you or even to themselves. But you get to walk away with peace, knowing you gave your best, not from blind sacrifice, but from the clarity of a mature heart. So if you're healing now, finding your voice again after a quiet, painful kind of love, remember this: you were a gift, not a burden, and what you gave wasn't wasted. It reached the deepest part of the man, whether they say it or not, it left a mark. Keep living and loving the way you do, clearly, kindly, and with boundaries. Because real love doesn't come from contorting yourself to be chosen. It comes from knowing who deserves to stay when you finally stop bending to be loved.